So when I started thinking about this, I had a real challenge trying to put this presentation together, and Dave and I sort of went back and forth a few times. And the other night I was talking to my husband and I said, what do we do that's the same, but where we do things differently in that same space? You know, so if we're both doing the dishes, how do we do them differently because I'm a woman and he's a man? And he just went, I don't know. And then so I kept asking him, I'm like, no, come on, think about it. There must be some things, like, you know, he comes home and he'll say he's done the laundry, but what he's actually done is he's taken the laundry basket and he's thrown it at the washing machine. And then I come along and actually do the laundry. So we're having this conversation and I'm going, what is it? What other things do we do that are different? And he looks at me and he goes, well, you talk a lot more than I do. And I went, yeah, okay. So I looked at that, and that's actually true. So number one, women do talk about twice as much as men. They've done studies on it. So women have about 7,000 words a day on average. Men have about 3,000 to 4,000. So if you're talking to your fella and you feel like he's not listening to you because he's sitting there and he's just going, he's just grunting, he probably is paying attention, or maybe he's not. I don't know. What do you do, guys? Are you listening or are you not? Or maybe he's just run out of words for the day. Maybe he's already used up all his words. So there are some differences, but there's also not very, you know, we're more the same than we are different. So on your chairs there's a handout. So this is some of the information we'll be going through today. So please feel free to contact me if you would like more information or want to talk through some specific issues on this topic. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. Going to the brain science, so this is the neuroimaging stuff, the functional and structural MRI scans that they can do on people's brains these days. So looking at brain differences and similarities, personality differences and similarities, and then information that you can use as a coach to enhance your coaching environment depending on whether or not you're working with men or women. My challenge to you today is to listen for the nuggets. You know, there'll be some things that I say that you won't agree with, and that's fine. And there'll be some things that you say that you just go, oh, that's dumb, and that's fine as well. But look for the nuggets. So find some takeaway points that you can use to take away. And if I've got time at the end, I'll ask you for a selection on what those things are. So I'm going to be talking to you about sex, so males and females. So that's quite different from gender. So sex is very binary. You're a male or you're a female, whereas gender is a socially constructed concept. At one end there's men, at the other end there's women, and then in between there's everything else. So I'm just looking at biological sex differences. We're not getting into the gender issue at all, so that would take a lot longer than 45 minutes. I started off trying to read this book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Is everyone aware of this? Yeah, it's truly horrible. It's awful. This was written in 1995. And just the language is so dated. So I picked up another one, a book called The Gendered Brain by a neuroscientist, Gina Rippon, so a woman. And that's just been released this year, and it's all about societal images of brain differences between men and women, and what the science is telling us now based on current research. And that was equally as horrible. That was really awful. So this one was written by a man in 1995, using really sexist language from that period, and the one that I read, the recent one, was just as bad. It was written by a woman who seemed to be anti-men. So I think the differences between men and women, the themes are carrying through, irrespective of when the texts were written and what languages we're using. There's a psychological theory called social self-determination theory, and that suggests that up to 70% of our behaviours are influenced by the environment. So keeping in mind that this was written in 1995, I think the language that's used in this book was very much influenced by how society was 25 years ago. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as well. What is appropriate to do today? Well, what was appropriate to do back in the 80s Probably not so appropriate to do today. And my daughter, she's learning Spanish. We were talking about this yesterday, and she's only 10, she's just started, and she's going, what's the difference between señorita and señora? So we're going, yeah, one's a miss, one's a missus. And then, well, what do you call a man? Well, he's a señor. And then, well, what do you call a boy? Well, yeah, you call them master, don't you? But that's not really a term that's commonly used. So just sort of thinking about how society puts labels on people, even in terms of the prefixes we put in front of people's names. Why do we have to distinguish between whether or not a woman is married or not, whereas it doesn't matter for a man? So, you know, just sort of the language that we use and challenging those things and being aware of where things that distinguish between men and women inappropriately may or may not exist. There's a caveat to this as well. I am not a feminist. Okay, I don't necessarily think that women should be CEOs if they also have to run a household, look after the children, take the kids to hockey practice, do all those other things as well. I think that everyone should do what they want to do that works best for them. Okay, so moving into it, brain differences. So I'm going to start with the science. So there's been massive developments in technology, as you're all aware, over the last few decades, and psychology has been affected by that as much as any of the other disciplines. So we can now do neuroimaging. Previously, we used to only be able to look at dead people's brains. So you'd have to wait till someone died before you could cut their head open and pull apart their brain. So the information that you got from that was fairly limited. Now we can put real, live, living people into the MRI and we can scan their brains. And we do what's called structural, well, not me, we do what's called structural MRIs, which is like photographs of the brain, where we can take a photograph from a static moment and know what's happening and look at different signals in the brain. Or we can put people into the MRI and we can ask them to do a specific task. So we can show them photos of people who are happy or people who are sad or people who are angry, and we can get them to watch them and see which parts of the brain are lighting up in response to the different facial expressions. So those are the sorts of experiments that neuroscientists might do with people. And they will look at differences between men and women, and they'll try to do similar things with children and see where these differences start occurring. So the other important difference in in statistical science actually is the development of software. So the software has progressed to the point where we can now examine huge amounts of data. So one study I looked at called a meta-synthesis, which was a meta-analysis of 500 different studies, and a meta-analysis in itself is relationships with some assumptions about what's appropriate and what's not. So the neonatal studies, yeah, I've talked about that. That's the differences in the brain size. There's a really cool finger test you can do. So one thing they measured back in the day when they thought, oh yeah, there's these big differences between men and women, let's find all these different ways of working out what they are, was they looked at levels of prenatal testosterone. So that means the amount of male hormones that was in the fetus before it was born. So there's a really cool test that you can do to look at that. So if you hold your fingers up, your 3 middle fingers up in front of you, and look at your index finger and your ring finger. So if your index finger is shorter than your ring finger, then you had higher levels of testosterone in the womb before you were born. If your index finger is longer than your ring finger, then you had lower levels of testosterone in the womb before you were born. Tricky, eh? But what does this mean? So what if you had lower or higher levels of testosterone? So they checked that And actually they worked out that it means absolutely nothing at all. There's no impact at all. So they measured behaviours in terms of people that had higher levels of prenatal testosterone and those that had lower levels of prenatal testosterone, and there was no significant difference at all. So things like that they measure, they go, oh, we'll find a difference that way, don't actually mean anything sometimes. There's a very common idea that women are more empathetic than men. So the neuroscientists found a really clever way to measure this in babies, and they found that there was no difference between boy babies and girl babies in terms of empathy. So the parts of the brain that were lighting up when they saw a picture of a face that was sad or unhappy or crying was the same in boys and girls. So that difference doesn't exist at birth. There's a very recent study from February of this year which found that women display more sensory activation in pain areas of the brain when witnessing another person's pain than do men. So they got people to watch a video of someone being electrocuted, someone pretending to be electrocuted, because you're not allowed to do that anymore, right? And responding like they were being electrocuted. And they found that women's brains lit up much more in the pain sensory area. So what this tells us is not that women are more empathetic, but that women are potentially more sensitive to mirroring the emotions displayed by the people that they're in contact with. So that means that I'm going to be much better at my husband at recognising when my child is upset, happy, angry, whatever those things are. And that's actually true. That's one of the differences between me and my husband. So the difference is, if there is a difference in women's levels of empathy, it develops as part of that software over time. It's not present in the hardware at birth. So the biggest point here, I think, is that brains reflect the lives they have lived and not just the sex of their owners. So what does this mean in terms of coaching? So this is in your handouts. So there's there's a continuum. So the environment that we live in, and remembering that up to 70% of our behaviour comes from the environment that we're in. And this is to do with the physiological response to fear and stress as well. So as a coach, you create that environment. So you can create an environment of fear or one of courage. People, irrespective of their sex, are going to do much better when they're given an environment in which they can thrive. So this does not mean that fear, stress, challenges or demands do not exist. It just means that they happen in an environment where the individual feels supported and feels that it's okay to give those challenges a go, irrespective of whether or not they're successful. So you can see the differences there in between them. So this is to do with the fight or flight response, right? Everybody's aware of the fight or flight response. So you can see how those things come up. So when we're scared, upset, anxious, vulnerable, we'll tighten up, we'll hide, we'll withdraw, we'll isolate, we'll get more aggressive. We'll do all those things. So we're not in a state where we can perform at our best. When we're relaxed, focused, calm, present, and we're in an environment where we feel supported to do that, then our brains are going to be much more able to take in the information and execute the tasks that are being asked of us. So in terms of stress and performance, within that culture of courage, this still happens, right? We still get stress. We're still asking our people to develop, but to develop in a thriving way. So the idea is not to get rid of stress at all. The idea is to coach our athletes to be able to deal with it in an effective way that allows for their level of optimal performing. So with the developing athletes, this is great because this gives you an opportunity to push this all the way over here and develop them further. So the idea is that we'd get this curve, the top bit of the curve, much wider, so that the level of optimal performance is greater for our athletes. So when we've got too much stress, we become anxious, our brains shut down, they stop working, we become overwhelmed, and we're unable to perform. All we're trying to do is get through that situation and get out of there so that we can feel safe again. Same when we don't have enough stress. So if we're not under pressure at all, we're not going to perform very well either, because who cares? So that's to do with stress and performance. We can relabel these axes resilience and trauma. So people that have no trauma at all in their lives have no resilience. They're unable to deal with mental and physical stress. People that have high loads of trauma, so this is combat veterans, those sorts of people, PTSD types, they're unable to deal with stress very well either, and that's because their whole world schema has been tipped upside down, and what they thought they knew, they have to relearn over again. But medium levels of trauma, so this is, pressure under training, pressure in the coaching environment, competition pressure, those sorts of things all build resilience in our athletes. So helping your athletes to cope with them in an effective way and supported way is going to not only build their levels of resilience, but also help to push this optimal level of performance under stress out, so that they can perform, they can continue to grow, develop, and perform better with increased levels of stress. So don't shy away from putting your athletes under pressure or stress. Just the way we do it might be different for boys and girls. So we've talked a little bit about, we haven't talked about redhead and bluehead, sorry, because I took that slide out last night. So if you think about this, the previous one, this one as redhead. So in the sports psychology literature, we talk about redhead and bluehead. So redhead is where we shut down and don't perform well. Bluehead is where we're in a space where we've got optimum levels of stress and we can perform well. We're still able to think clearly, rationally, logically, and work our way through that. And that occurs in the thriving environment, and redhead comes off in the surviving environment. So as you watch this video, this is a friend of mine, Stafford, and his wife bought for him a grab one thing, I think, for jumping off the Sky Tower in Auckland. He hates heights. He's really scared of heights. Has anyone done that? Anyone jumped off the Sky Tower or something similar? Anyone scared of heights? Is this particular activity. We're not going to do it now, but you may want to do it with your teams. If you do, I would suggest that you do it yourself first so that you know what to expect. And you might also too want to ask your teams to do this with regards to you, to give you some feedback on what they see your triggers as being. Because if they see you in fight, flight, freeze mode, then chances are, especially if you're working with girls and women, they're going to mirror your emotions and they're going to pick up on that and be able to, and that will put them into that state as well. So that's an activity for you to do with your teams if you would like to. But why do we get into redhead to start with? Why does that even come on? So this is a model called the cognitive behavioural model. In sports psychology, we refer to it sometimes as the performance supply chain. And it determines, you'll see up there, situations. So take that as the environment, remembering that up to 70% of our behaviours are influenced by the environment. So the situation will influence our thoughts. And these are subconscious thoughts, so we're not necessarily aware of them. And this process happens in our brain in 1/100th of a second. So it's super quick, and it goes through something called the amygdala in the limbic system, which is the home of emotion. So that's why our emotions come out really quickly, and they fluctuate, and they change really quickly. And emotion will override logic, because logic sits in this part of the brain, and for our thoughts to get out there, it takes about 10/100ths of a second. So the emotional system is super quick. That's why it becomes our default to go to. And the thoughts that we have are based on the software that we've put into our brains since our birth. So our thoughts, values, attitudes, experiences, and memories. The memory sits very close to the emotional system as well, and they're completely linked. They're sending feedback to and from each other all the time. So the situation will send that signal to our limbic system, and it will go straight to our memory. What's a similar situation I've been in? How do I need to behave? How do I need to think, feel? How does my body need to respond? So that's why it happens this way. And this is why different people will react in different ways to the same situation. Why you might get an athlete who ends up in tears or overwhelmed or experiencing high levels of fatigue, and you get another athlete who's thriving and developing and really responding well to the challenge. So this is what we see. We can't see these other things. We see this. So being able to read people's behaviour is an integral skill as humans, and it's very, very important when we're coaching people. But understanding that our behaviour comes mostly from our feelings, because we can identify when we're feeling sad, upset, unhappy, scared, overwhelmed, fearful. We can't necessarily click into what the thoughts are that sit behind those feelings. So if you are working with athletes who are experiencing inappropriate or common negative reactions to what they're doing, just asking them, how are you feeling? You can see, but asking them to explain that. Because you might see it as fear, they might describe it as something different. So what are you feeling? And then what are the thoughts that are driving that feeling? What are you thinking that's telling you to feel this way? And you might start to get some clues about why they behave that way. So that can be quite a good way to get to that. But luckily, we are in charge of our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviours, so we can change this stuff. It takes quite a bit of work, and depending how in-ground those responses are, but we can change it if we want to. Some people don't want to. So here's another activity to help your athletes with that, and again, we're not going to do it now. This is for you to look through later. But getting them to think about a time when they felt focused, attentive, and in control. When they were in that thrive space and that optimal performance. And just going through their thoughts, emotions, and behaviours in that space. And then looking for ways that they can replicate that. What could you do that ensures that you get this response every time? And working through this with your athletes can help with that. And getting them to do it together in a group situation is probably going to work really well for girls or women. Okay, so moving through quickly. Some personality differences. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I'm sceptical. So differences between men and women have been researched since about the mid-18th century, so about 250 years or so. Men have been looking for ways. So that means that if we did the same test, the same scientific study 100 times, we would notice a difference 95 of those 100 times. So that gives us a pretty good idea that the difference is significant. And then we look at the effect size, because you could have a very good, significantly different population, but the difference between those two populations might be so small it doesn't mean anything. So what we're looking for is an effect size. An effect size means that if we have a population of men, statistically distributed, and a population. So here's some differences between the genders and this has come from the gender similarities crowd, because I figure if they're finding differences, then they're probably there. So fight. Men are much more likely to respond with verbal and physical aggression to a situation, and they display greater dominance than women. Women have more relational aggression. Now this is the undermining, the gossiping, the bitching, the damaging social status and relationships that goes on for a longer period of time. So women do that more than men. Men will get in there, have a bust up, it's all over. We all know that. Flight response. Men have higher emotional responsibility. Women have greater apprehension, so women are probably more likely to display a flight response. Same with the freeze response, probably greater in women because we have higher levels of apprehension. Men are more emotionally stable, and we saw that with Stafford's response. He was emotionally stable, we didn't see him get upset, but he froze. So that might come out in how it looks like. Fixing. Women are probably more likely to fix because we have higher levels of sensitivity and warmth and greater nurturing behaviour. Men have these things. This one's interesting. Greater heroic or chivalrous help. So they're more likely to rush in and be the hero, but only when people are watching. When they think they're not being watched, they won't engage in that behaviour. And then faking. Again, we're probably going to see that in men more than women, because women are going to be more apprehensive, and we might see that come out in their behaviours and their emotions. So from the gender similarities crowd, here's some interesting differences that came out. See, the effect size is over 0.7, so it's good, it's high. Masculine versus feminine traits. What that means is that women are perceived as more feminine and men are perceived as more masculine. So yeah, it's got a good effect size, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Interest in people versus things. Those of you who've listened to Jordan Peterson, anyone here aware of him? He has some good information. He talks about the difference between men and women and people and things a lot. So this is really important for you as coaches, in that if you're coaching women, you're going to have to do much more of that social nurturance stuff. You're going to have to give them time to chat, to debrief, to help each other, to nurture. Whereas if you're coaching men, just chuck a ball in and let them run around with it. Chase the thing. This one's interesting too. So confidence and physical abilities. Men are much more confident in their physical abilities than women. So you might have women who are highly competent, but they're not confident. So working with that might come out as well in gender differences. Alternatively, you might get men that are really confident, but not that competent. So, so it works both ways. Okay, are we out of time, Dave?
Couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes. Okay, so what can you do? This is all in your handout, so you can go back through and have a read of it. So motivation. As a coach, this one is the most desirable. Athletes who are intrinsically motivated are self-starters. They will get to training on time. They will do what you ask them to. They will take your advice on nutrition, diet, training, strength and conditioning, all of those sorts of things. And they're growth orientated, so they're looking to develop and perform. So how do we influence this? You as the coach create the motivational climate. What we're trying to do is get it to be intrinsic. How you create that is based on your interpersonal style. So this is your values and your coaching behaviours that you exhibit. So if you turn up and you're used to coaching boys, and you turn up to rugby training, and you're like, get out there, run around the field, rah, rah, rah. That might work for boys, but if you try it with girls, you might have quite a different response from your athletes. So how do we create this? This is where we talked about with Stafford's response previously. We talked about autonomy and social relatedness. So autonomy is going to appeal to both men and women, and that's feeling that I'm in charge of what I do. So that's going back to that performance supply chain. I can take charge of myself and I can choose what I do. Competence will appeal to men because they have greater belief in their physical abilities. So this is feeling that one has the necessary skills and abilities to achieve the desired outcomes. And social relatedness, so this is the people versus things that will appeal to women more. And that's gaining that satisfaction from having positive personal relationships with other people. So as the coach, you want to try to create an environment that has autonomy, competence and social relatedness. And elite athletes have been surveyed in this area, and these are the effects that it has. The athlete thinks they've improved better, they have more satisfaction with their performance, and their levels of stress is decreased, which means they can stay in that optimal performance zone. So how does the coach do that? Positive feedback and specific coaching behaviours. I didn't really know what that meant, so I went out and I asked a bunch of athletes. When they were in a situation, in an environment where the coach was doing those things, what did that mean? And this is what they said. Then you can relate them back to each of those three things. So remembering that autonomy appeals to men and women, social relatedness is going to appeal more to men than to women than men. Not that it doesn't appeal to men, but it's going to be more important to women, and the competence is going to be more important for men than it is for women. So here's some ideas about what those athletes said, and this was men and women athletes, so it wasn't just one sex. So you can have a look at these things and see what you're doing, and if there's something that you could do that might make a difference with the athletes that you coach. Does that make sense? Sorry, I went through that really quickly. Okay, so we looked at some brain differences, some personality differences, which there are. So we're more the same than we are different, but even the gender similarities crowd acknowledge that there are some differences. And then in your, to create a thriving coaching environment, tailor it specifically for men or women by allowing for autonomy, but creating opportunities for men to display competence and women to have that social connectedness. I hope that gives you some information. Hands up if you know more about this stuff than you did 45 minutes ago. Good. I hope there's some tips in there that you can all take and use. Thank